Welcome everyone to the June 2024 Ask Evoke question and answer with Kylee, Toth, and me, Scott Johnston. We do this every month where folks submit questions and we do our best to answer them and try to help give some guidance to our audience. One of the things that Kylee and I keep remarking about each month, we're getting more and more deeper, more probing questions, and which is great. It challenges us a bit, but it also shows that people are thinking more deeply about their training. So that's wonderful. We're glad we're having that effect. Welcome, Kylee.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Yeah, and from all over the world too. So yeah, keep your questions coming. Yeah. We really enjoy that. Well, why don't we just go ahead.
Go ahead, Kylee. No, I said we have quite a list today, so we better dive in.
Yeah, for sure. That's what I was gonna say here. So, Scott, our first question is from Frank, and he says, "Hi to the Evoke team. First of all, thanks a lot for the great readings, especially the training for the uphill athlete book. Secondly, also thanks for the podcast, always refreshing the mix between science and hands-on recommendations. I'm training for ultras between 50 to 120 kilometers with elevation. In my high volume peak weeks, I run twice a day, 3 times per week. My question is, when do I insert zone 3-4 sessions? In the morning before breakfast, I have a 1 to 2 hour in zone 1, and in the evening, mostly the same. Since some weeks I put some uphill sprints in the evening, but this affects my sleeping and it suffers. I can't make the zone 3-4 training in the morning because then I can't perform at work how I want to. So my question is, does it even make sense to add zone 3-4 training in the evening, and to what extent? Also, what can I do to improve my sleep for the next morning sessions? Because to be honest, it's more suffering in the mornings. Thanks a lot for the training. Greetings from Switzerland, Frank."
Well, that's a lot of questions there, Frank, but I have a feeling that the zone 4 is the problem, probably not the zone 3. When you say zone 3-4, my hunch is you're doing your interval training too hard, and that's both why it maybe affects your sleep if you do it in the evening, and would perhaps affect your work during the day. So I would, especially given the distances that you're training for, 50 to 120 kilometers, we've in the past few years, we've been steering most of the ultra endurance athletes that we work with away from doing pretty much any zone 4 work, except perhaps during some peaking workouts. And I could explain the physiology a little bit, but I don't want to go, we've got a lot of questions to answer today, so I won't go too deeply into that. But just thinking about how often or how much time will you spend in zone 4 in a 120 kilometer race? I would hope it is 0 minutes, because if you spend much time in zone 4, you're going to probably have a very short or very unhappy race experience. And so I think that first thing I would do is just cut out any zone 4, and I would probably do these zone 3 sessions with longer duration, let's say 3 by 15 minutes, that sort of thing, in low to mid zone 3. And you'll have to determine, your own heart rates for that. But and another thing I would say is, you could include those hill sprints in a somewhat more casual fashion into one of your morning easy runs. And that'll give you a good warm up, maybe to run to the hill. You do 5 or 6 sprints up the hill, and I think you'll find that that's not going to be doing them in the morning when you're a little fresher. When I do that kind of thing, often it makes me feel more energized during the day. And the same, I would say the same with this zone 3 work. If you did it in the morning, I can't believe it's going to leave you destroyed for work. Mm-hmm. I don't think that would be the case. My hunch is you're doing this high intensity training too hard, and as a consequence, you're suffering from it. I don't think you need to train that hard. I don't think it's a good way to train. I don't think it's good for your body. And I think in your case, especially, it's not It's not your life is getting screwed up from it. Another thought is to stack your hard work into 1 or 2 days of the week. So maybe in the morning you do these, an easy run with a few hill sprints thrown in, and in the evening you do some zone 3 or vice versa or something like that. And I think you would find that that way you've got recovery days where there's nothing but zone 1 and 2 training in between these. You kind of by blocking the high intensity into particular days rather than trying to spread high intensity out through, let's say, 3 or 4 days during the week. Then you've got almost no rest between these high intensity sessions. So I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, I'd also suggest really good warm up in the morning, because sometimes you said you feel suffering in the morning, and I can relate sometimes. And so just start really, really easy and work your way into that sort of tempo pace, like Scott was saying. And I can also relate to the training after 4. It really wires me as well for whatever reason. So I think you could avoid it altogether, the zone 3 in the evenings, and just do that in the morning. Yeah. I can't sleep if I mountain bike in the evening either.
Yeah. I have the same thing. It's like, the day after or the evening or the night after any kind of hard effort that was quite exhausting, I usually toss and turn a lot, don't sleep well. So I think it's better to, that's why I'm advocating for this zone 3 rather than zone 4. And I think you'd play around with that, Frank, and see if that doesn't make it easier on your body.
For sure. Good. All right, let's jump into our next question. And this question says, I'm a relatively fit athlete, currently running 50 miles per week, training for ultras and trail running. I'm interested in getting into mountaineering, but unfortunately live at sea level in the southeast, far from any snowy peaks. Besides the foundational endurance fitness, what can I do to prepare for mountaineering where I am? I'm thinking more technical skills. I have virtually no experience working with mountaineering equipment, ropes, etc. Only one time moderately difficult winter Colorado 14,000er. I'm assuming he's done one of those. Would rock climbing help just for gaining familiarity with knots, ropes, and the mental aspects? And then he said, as a follow-up, any recommendations for a beginner mountain for someone like me? Something to travel to, but hopefully could tackle in less than a week with a guide service. Would Rainier be biting off more than I can chew? Thank you, Philip. So this is from a newer mountaineer.
Yeah, great questions. So I'm going to, before we launch into the technical and skills part, I think one thing I would add into your base training, your running and that sort of thing now, is to put stairs into your training, either on a stair machine like a Stairmaster or hiking stairs in a tall building, because while your running is going to give you a great base of aerobic fitness, you do need that more specific uphill work. And so sticking in 1 or 2 of those kind of workouts in a week will help. As far as the skills go, while doing some rock climbing will help you learn some knots, it's really not very transferable over to low technical difficulty mountaineering. And a climbing gym will do even less probably for your mountaineering skills. I mean, it's great fun to climb on those in a climbing gym, but it's nothing at all like climbing steeply up a steep snowy mountain. So do it for fun and maybe social reasons, and perhaps you'll meet other people that are into climbing that way. But I wouldn't suggest you're going to learn a great deal about mountaineering in a climbing gym, or even outdoor rock climbing. It's not going to help you that much. What most people do, and what I would recommend, is to take a multi-day course either from a guide service, or if you can afford it, and it's much better, I think, value even, is to hire a private guide. Because in these courses, if you're going to spend 3 or 4 days probably living in the snow on a mountain, and you're dealing with the whole mountaineering experience, for 24 hours a day, sleeping in the snow, melting water, we're learning about crevasse rescues, all those kinds of things. And unfortunately, you can't learn any of those skills anywhere except on a mountain to do it. The private guide, the recommendation is that you will get a lot more individual attention with a guide. You'll learn much faster, and you will, I think, the instruction can be tailored to your own needs rather than to a group. So even though there's an appeal that a group getting together for 4 or 5 days on a mountain is much cheaper, it seems much cheaper, you're going to get so much more out of a private guide that if it's at all financially possible, I would recommend doing that. Mm-hmm. And then with regards to recommendations for beginner mountains, yeah, I think, Rainier's would be a great choice. However, you live at sea level and it's 14,000 feet. So I think you need to first kind of cut your teeth on some more intermediately high mountains. And I was going to recommend another good big snowy one is Baker, only 10,000 feet, but it have a lot of pretty much all the same mountaineering challenges and skills required. And, but it will be much easier for you to go from sea level to 10,000 than it is from sea level to 14. It's also, I'm pretty sure, going to be quite a bit cheaper to hire a guide to go off the guide service on that. I would set some non-snowy mountain intermediate. Sounds like you've been to Colorado. That might be closer for you. You won't be dealing with snow, but you might get some exposure to altitude and just see how you handle altitude. But I think that getting an indoctrination, like going on a 4-day Mount Baker mountaineering course, would be a really good idea, because it's at the end of that, you're going to know whether, oh, I hate this, or no, this is something I really want to pursue more. And I think that'll give you a chance to check that out. What do you think, Kylee?
Yeah, I think I relate to this question quite a bit as someone who comes from more of an endurance background. And I would say one of the first things to wrap your mind around is, especially if you're going guided, mountaineering is slow compared to trail running, the pace you're going to go at. So, try a multi-day backpacking trip with your tent and everything in your backpack for training and things, because it's much more tedious than trail running, although it has an appeal as well because it's beautiful and interesting. And then, yeah, like a crevasse rescue kind of course, if it's a glaciated mountain you want to go on, that would be the rope skills you would kind of need. But I agree with Scott. You could probably get more out of one-on-one. But yeah, that would be my biggest thing, is the pace that you'll have to wrap your mind around for mountaineering. So see if you like it. Yeah. Good. Okay.
Well, thanks, Philip.
Yeah, that's great. The next question we have here is, I've been training using plans from a large online coaching platform for the past years. It's mostly self-directed, using plans prescribed by coaches with occasional consultation. And just a caveat, it's not our company. So it says, it recently became clear that I've been advised to use heart rate zones incorrectly, and I'm concerned that I've pushed myself into aerobic deficiency. Early in the program, the coaches assessed my data from heart rate drift test and told me I just had a naturally high heart rate. My aerobic threshold test put me at around 170. So I worked off that number for many months. Now I think I'm showing signs of aerobic deficiency, high heart rate at very low RPE, a history of frequent illness over the past year, and static decreasing endurance. I'm feeling very discouraged and frustrated. For context, I'm a 30-year-old woman and I'm quite active. Most of the time in the mountains is spent touring and carrying heavy packs. I frequently do 5K touring days with a full pack. My heart rate is often 165 to 185 for hours at a time while I'm skinning. I cannot complete a trail run with my heart rate going to at least 170, but I can keep going for 10-ish miles in flat rolling terrain with relative ease. I'm accustomed to carrying heavy packs all day without getting wrecked. I took the last 2 months off of training for a mental reset, and I'm ready to get started again. I'm highly motivated, but I'm worried about doing more damage. Any suggestions on how to get going again? And this question is from Alyssa. So there's a lot of information there. I think she's really asking about her heart rates being inaccurate as well on that one.
Yeah, well, we can't speculate about your drift test. However, what I would recommend, Alyssa, is if you're willing to, and you can certainly use a pseudonym if it suits you, post something on our on the aerobic assessment part of our forum, and we or somebody will look at it for you and with you. I mean, I'm happy to do that and give you my thoughts on that drift test. I don't know how long ago it was taken, but we can, that would be a place to start. But my guess from what you've said is this, I think these signs of aerobic deficiency, a high heart rate at low RPE, a history of frequent illness over the past year, static and decreasing endurance, and feeling discouraged and frustrated. Those all sound a lot like overtraining to me, especially the frequent illness and then the decreasing performance. And probably a little bit of the burnout factor, the way if I read between the lines here. And so the fact that you've taken a couple of months off, hopefully you're beginning to feel good again and excited about training. I take it you are, because you bothered to write in and ask about how to get started. So hopefully you're getting excited for it. That's a good sign. And it might be now in a rested state. This would be the time to do another heart rate drift test and just see how it looks. Your high heart rates are, not that uncommon. We see them often, but it's a little hard without knowing more about you to say, that the heart rate has been too high or too low. I can't really tell you that. It would be interesting to know. And if you do put something on our forum, tell us what your resting heart rate is as well, when you're well rested, like right now before you start training. But the fact that you can carry packs that are more than 40% of your body weight, and you can go, with your heart rate at 170 for 10 miles, and you doing these, big days, 5,000 vertical feet on ski touring with a big pack, you have a lot of work capacity. So you are quite fit. Now, whether you need to do some more work aerobically, that's that's open to interpretation. And like I said, we'd probably want to see that heart rate drift test. But just the fact that you can do all these things you wrote down is impressive. And hopefully that, you shouldn't feel discouraged about that. You are a fit person. My guess is you've just been training too hard and you're too tired, and run down. And it would be great to help you get some zones, more effective zones set up for you. That'd be my best recommendation.
Yeah, Scott, this is as someone who writes training plans at our company, and you have too. This is always something I'm worried about when people just the difference between coaching and just like a training plan is it's hard to fine tune things for people as well. And I think one thing, if you are quite fit, is the top of zone 2 is quite a large load, and you can overtrain yourself doing too much top of zone 2. And so I think just making sure, if you're not aerobically deficient to start, that when you do a stock training plan, there isn't too much of that like aerobic threshold work is pretty important. What do you think, Scott?
I agree with that. It's possible that you've been training at the upper end of your zone 2 a lot, and as a consequence are feeling the fatigue from that. And another thing is that it's easy the fact that we can see real-time heart rates is a wonderful tool for us to use. But I think as modern Westerners, we can become sort of data-driven in our approach to life. And I think you need to remember that your body is constantly sending you feedback signals, and don't ignore those and become like too fixated on the heart rate itself, because while heart rate is a handy metric, it's not perfect. And if you're feeling a certain way, like listen to that. And like I will always tell people that your perception should outweigh what the heart rate says. If you're feeling tired, you're tired. It doesn't care what your heart rate is. In your case, it sounds to me, based on what you've been saying, you've you had to have been tired to see decreasing performance. So anyway, my suspicion is you've kind of overtrained yourself, but hopefully you've bounced back from that and are ready to launch into a new and perhaps more successful building period.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. Thanks for your question. And as Scott said, a great resource is our forum. If you have more questions or, want a more detailed analysis. So check that out as well. So our next question is a bit specific, and it says, it's from Stefan, and he says, currently my volume is approximately 10 to 14 hours a week, 9 hours of running and 1 to 5 hours of hiking and biking. I was wondering about 24-minute intervals between aerobic.
No, let me. I think he mistyped that. Excuse me for interrupting you, Kylee.
No, this is good.
When I read through this, I was confused, but I believe there's some typos in here.
Okay.
And he actually meant, instead of 24, he meant zone 4. Because when I read the rest of his questions, so I think there was just a few typos in this question, the way we received it. So
sure.
So
he's wondering,
when you read the question again, read it as zone 4 rather than 24.
Okay, so he was saying he works out 10 to 14 hours a week and 9 hours of running, 1 to 5 hours of hiking and biking. And he was wondering about zone 4 intervals between aerobic and anaerobic threshold. He says some do 4 by 8 minutes, up to 3 by 20 minutes, or even 2 by 30-minute intervals. What is the difference between long, 20 to 30 minute, and short, 8-minute zone 4 intervals? Which is better to do in training for a fast 40 to 60 kilometer trail race?
Okay. Well, let's clear up some nomenclature. And first of all, I would say that we wouldn't call the zone between aerobic and anaerobic threshold zone 4. I think most people wouldn't. Zone 4 intensity is typically reserved for that intensity range that is above the second lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold. We would call this zone, and I think most people do who use the 4 or 5 zone system, that the zone between the aerobic and anaerobic threshold is zone 3, not zone 4. So let's get that stated right off the bat. Then the longer the work period, the lower the intensity will have to be. I mean, there is no way you can do 2 by 30-minute intervals and stay in zone 4. That's just not going to happen. It's not possible to sustain that kind of work output for that long. You will have to be somewhat below zone 4 with that. And especially, and even if you did, I would say that's even if you were capable of doing 3 by 20 minutes above your second threshold, lactate threshold, I would say that's not a very effective training strategy, and I'll get into that here in a minute. But when you think about the 4 by 8 minutes, so there's 32 minutes of hard work. 8 minutes is possible, for people to do 32 minutes of hard work and stay in zone 4. But what happens with most people is by the third repetition, they're going to be slowing down. They will not be able to get their heart rate back up into zone 4 because of the local muscular fatigue. And I typically what you see people doing with zone 4 is work in the range of 3 to 5 minutes, because there it's possible to sustain that kind of work output without getting extreme muscular fatigue that makes you slow down. But if you've ever had that experience of going to do an interval workout, and by let's say you're doing this 4 by 8 minutes, and on the third one, you can't go as far or you can't get your heart rate up as high, that's happening because your muscles are fatiguing and causing you to slow down. And once your muscles fatigue and you slow down, you're not getting the benefit of zone 4 training anymore. You're basically training yourself to work really hard, but not go very fast. And that's not what, as an athlete, you should be doing. And this is actually, in Norway, this is one of the ways they control intensity. Like if they want athletes doing zone 4, they will have their, I'm talking about, let's say, World Cup cross-country skiers. they'll be training between 4 and 6 and sometimes up to 8-minute repetitions. When they want them to stay in zone 3, they'll prescribe, 15 to 20 or even 30-minute long repetitions. So they can basically, the coach can, even without using heart rate, if he tells you, I want you to do 4 by 6 minutes, and I want your last 6-minute repetition to be just as fast as the first one was, then that's going to designate basically how hard you can go. Same thing if you're doing 3 by 20 minutes, you're not going to be able to do that first one extremely hard, or the last one will be very slow. So I would say probably spend more time in zone 3 for you're looking for information about what would be more effective for these races. Your races are, even he said, what is
40 to
race
60,
distance?
so
Yeah, 40
pretty
to
long.
60. So still over 2 hours for these races. So when you get over 2 hours, I think the benefits of doing zone 4 training, the cost benefit ratio goes out the window, because it's so taxing to train in zone 4. And once again, as I mentioned in that previous question, you're not going to spend any time in zone 4. You're training a metabolic system that you will not use in that race. You will be getting some benefits from muscular endurance training in zone 4, that's for sure, but at a huge overall fatigue cost. We don't use, so as I said earlier, don't use zone 4 except rarely. And, even with some of the best mountain runners in the world, instead we do a high volume of zone 3 type training. Now, this zone 3 training can be done fast or at slower speeds that are more race specific. So a workout could be 10 by 1 kilometers with only a minute rest in between those. And that would be, from a lactate's perspective, that would be a zone 3 type workout, or 6 by 2 minutes with a 1 minute rest. Or, if you could go longer and slower, like 3 by 20, that would be the place you would do these. But once again, those are maybe more race specific intensities or speeds, but you can use this whole zone 3 thing for fast running and for more ultra race specific speed. But I would say that you're not going to get the benefits of the zone 4 that you might think you would. In fact, most of the time I've seen people who've run into overtraining issues is that they've done too much in zone 4.
Yeah, I think he also has to ask himself what he's trying to accomplish by the zone 4, because if he wants a faster turnover or leg speed, you usually prescribe, quite short hill sprints or something, as opposed to longer kind of zone 4 intervals. I think that is kind of thinking about, and I know a lot of athletes I coach, unfortunately, go out in races way too hard. So perhaps if you are going, up per zone 3, zone 4 at the start of a race, that might be a strategy you want to rethink, because then your body is just taking a lot of time to clear a bunch of lactate. So most people wouldn't be going that intensity in a 40 to 60 kilometer race, I don't think. Hey, Scott? Or they shouldn't be.
No, they will, like I said to that first person's question, you're going to have probably not an ideal experience in that race if you start off in zone 4. The zone 4 training has a place, but the longer the event you're training for, the less important it becomes, because it's just a metabolic intensity. It's an intensity whose metabolic support is one that you should not be using in that race. You should not be, in the high lactate stages or condition in a long distance race. If you do, it's going to end very poorly for you.
Yeah. Thanks for your question. And again, as Scott said with the last one, if you had more specific, head to the forum and ask another one there. So this next question is kind of funny. He says, how do short kings keep up with their long-legged friends hiking on the mountain without burning way more energy keeping up with them? And then he says, I wish I was tall. So,
well, you can train yourself to walk fast, even with short legs. So my wife is just a little bit over 5 feet tall, and I'm just a little bit over 6 feet tall. And yet I often find myself having to hurry to keep up with her. And so I think what you'll need to do is you can't match their tempo. You have to work at a faster turnover rate. So it'll take some time to train yourself for that, because initially when you try to, maybe you need to be turning over your legs 20% faster than your friends. Let's say your legs, your stride length is 20% shorter than theirs. Well, when you first try to train that, it's going to feel like any change in technique, it's going to be uncomfortable and it'll burn more energy initially. But once you get trained for it, you'll be able to keep up with them with the same intensity that they're going at.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just a matter of
Yeah.
practice.
What popped into mind in Canada, we're watching the NHL playoffs right now because I live in Alberta and the Edmonton Oilers are from our province. And the shorter guys, they have to be quick and agile in every sport, from a point guard to a quarterback or whatever. If they're a little bit smaller, they're quicker. So I guess it's applicable to mountaineering as well. Hey. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Good. The next question we have is a little bit unusual, but this person asks, how effective is it to use an indoor bike without a seat for muscular endurance training for trail running?
It is indoor or outdoor. One way to pretty much make your biking sessions more let's say run specific, is to take the seat off, because then you're not tempted to sit down. And I know I've mentioned this in the past about, there was a very famous American cross-country skier in the 70s, a guy who won, first American to win a medal in cross-country skiing, Bill Koch, who didn't like running. And he did a lot of his training on his bike, and much of it with removing the seat. So he had no temptation to sit down. So yeah, it is effective. And like I said, you could do it indoors or out. But I would, if you did this, I would warm up in a seated position first before I went into the standing position. Because going straight into standing up and harder muscular work without a good warm up, it's going to reduce the effectiveness of that muscular endurance training. And the way you would do this is, after you've done, let's say, 15 minutes of warming up in a seated position, and it's not necessary to take the seat off, but just stand up and shift into a big gear so that your tempo is somewhat like you were hiking up a very steep set of stairs. And just stand up and grind away. And it can be, muscular endurance training like this can be effectively done. And you could do minute on, minute off. You could do 10 minutes at a time. You could do 30 minutes at a time. Any sort of combination like that is going to have a good muscular endurance training effect. So I wouldn't worry too much about the actual protocol. It's going to do the job. But I would say, if you have any discipline whatsoever, and if you're only going to be standing up for, let's say, 5 minutes, then, and the seat will be there when you want to sit back down and spin for a couple of minutes to recover before you do it again. Having the seat on, I think, could be beneficial.
Yeah, maybe you could just put some tacks on the seat or something so you can't sit down. Just kidding. Yeah, no, it's a very effective workout for mountain biking too, or just if you're a cyclist, not just for runners, is to load up that sort of muscular endurance out of the seat workouts as well. So the next question, Scott, is how should I load a stair climb workout as a tactical athlete? It's kind of broad, but you would probably know how to answer that.
Yeah, we do a lot of this with tactical athletes. Well, first, I would suggest doing some of your, at least in the early phase, doing some of the stair climbing workouts without any weight on your back, just to develop sort of an endurance base for that kind of work before you jump right into heavily loaded. But once you have, when you feel comfortable that you can, let's say, hike up, I'd be on a Stairmaster hiking at 80 plus steps per minute for an hour, then maybe you're ready to shift into a different training protocol, and we would call that muscular endurance training. The way we would suggest you do that would be with a heavy pack, and a pack that's heavy enough that the fatigue in your legs is what's slowing you down or making you feel like you can't go any faster rather than your heart rate or your breathing. However, if you are breathing hard doing these, that's okay too. But generally, you're going to want a heavy enough pack that you really feel this in your legs. And the way we do it with our mountaineers and tactical guys is we'll get them on a treadmill like or on a stair machine because most people are not going to have access to very steep terrain outdoors. A standard hiking trail, might be in the 10 to 15% gradient range, and that just isn't enough for most people to elicit a good muscular endurance training effect. And the beauty of a stairmaster or a set of fire stairs in a building is, they can approach 100% grade. They're very close to 100% grade, but yet if you went on a 100% grade hill outside, you'd be sliding all over the place and be needing to hold on with your hands. So having the steps there actually allows you to do more effective work. But then, maybe you start with the first time doing 30 minutes, and then once a week is plenty for this kind of training. And you might build up to a total of an hour in a workout at this intensity we're talking about with the heavy pack. But once a week will be plenty. You don't need any more than that.
Great. Yeah. And probably also applicable to some mountaineers out there as well.
Absolutely. That's kind of where we got this idea. We've been doing with mountaineers for years.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, this next question is from Garrett, and he says, how much time should I spend on aerobic threshold runs to increase the top of my zone 2?
Well, Garrett, we don't probably have an easy answer for that without knowing a lot more about you. If you are aerobically deficient, then you should spend all your time right at your aerobic threshold in order to increase the top of zone 2. Now, how much time that is sort of dependent on you because it's improving aerobic capacity. The biggest stimulus for that is the volume of work you do in this aerobic realm. So more will be better until it's not better. Let's say you are just getting into this sort of thing. Well, I wouldn't suggest jumping into, running 80 miles a week because something will break. And so you have to find out what is your capacity for this type of work. I mean, the reason that, professional endurance athletes train such a prodigious volume is that that's what they need in order to keep their aerobic capacity high or to build it. But that doesn't mean that all of us can, ride our bikes 30 hours a week or, run 100 miles a week. That's not practical. So you need to determine, how much time do you have and what is your work capacity for this aerobic work. If it's very high, then by all means, doing more will help. I would say we've seen, actually, I wouldn't say that. I'll just take a step backwards. We have seen over the years very good results from people getting in 4 or 5 hours a week of aerobic training and seeing their aerobic threshold numbers improve within a few months. Now, one thing to remember is that eventually you're going to top out the zone 2. It can't go on and up and up and up forever. So don't try to milk this too far. Once you've reduced the spread between the aerobic and anaerobic threshold to 10% or less, then you're probably not going to move that zone 2 anymore. You might improve its speed, but you're not going to improve its heart rate. And that's when you would want to start adding a little more intensity into your training.
Yeah.
But maybe I should say, to finalize, a minimum, I would say, of 3 or 4 hours a week would be what I would recommend to see appreciable changes.
Yeah, I think as coaches, when we see someone's quite aerobically deficient, instead of saying, perceiving it as discouraging, I'm actually excited for them because they have a lot of easy gains on the table too. I'm like, you can, and we usually test 6 weeks, would you say, Scott? If someone's spread is quite big, retest, you might see a change. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's easy. These tests that we recommend, the heart rate drift test, it's free, easy to administer to yourself. And, doing that once every 4 to 8 weeks, somewhere in that range, most people will see, they'll see the needle move in that kind of month to month time frame.
For sure. Yeah. The next question, this is a really excellent question. I find I get this from a lot of clients. They said, how much does extended rest impact your aerobic base? For example, if you don't use it, you lose it. How much does extended rest impact your fitness? Does it come back faster?
Yeah, so by extended rest, I'm guessing time away from training, not like taking a couple of days of rest. You're probably either due to illness or injury or some other circumstance that's caused you to step away from doing your normal aerobic training for, let's say, weeks at a time, or maybe even months at a time. So it impacts it, sadly, it impacts it very quickly. It's the first quality that begins to deteriorate, and it begins to deteriorate within hours and days, frankly. In the first book, Training for the New Alpinism, I don't think I put this chart in the Uphill Athlete book, but I showed the drop off in the aerobic enzyme cytochrome C, which is one of the enzymes that's in the mitochondria that's responsible for aerobic respiration. It shows the drop off with bed rest. And I think it's within about 5 days, the levels of cytochrome C have decreased by about 50%. And that's why when you get sick with a cold or something, even for, let's say you lose a few days or a week of training and you come back and you feel so out of shape, it's because those aerobic enzymes have just, they're not used, so they go away. Your body doesn't want to keep stuff around that it's not using. But the beauty is that those, especially the enzymatic changes like that, they come back very fast. As soon as you start training again, you'll notice within a week, you'll start to feel, oh yeah, now I feel like my old self again. But that's because those aerobic enzymes are kind of, you're being stimulated to be produced more. Now, the longer you've had, or the bigger your aerobic base, the longer your history has been with aerobic training, the less impact that layoffs have, because you have so much what we call structural adaptations. These are changes to your heart, changes to the capillary density in the working muscles, things like that. Those don't go away. Well, they don't go away very fast. They take years to decline. It's why often you'll find, if you have friends who had a history of endurance training as a kid, if they haven't done much, they can kind of come off the couch and put in some very impressive performances sometimes. So anyway, try to avoid extended breaks if you can. And if you do have an extended break, then give yourself the grace of, a couple of weeks of very easy training to get your aerobic system back online again.
Yeah, I think that as coaches, the reason we often advise, if you feel sick or you have a slight injury, to get on top of it right away, is it's usually better to have a day or two of rest versus try to train through yourself into a hole and have to take like a week to 10 days. So I think trying to minimize it is good if people are feeling sick, because I can hear some of my clients listening to this and freaking out already if they get sick and have to take time off. But yeah, try to get on top of your health as quickly as you can and work from there. As an athlete myself, when I get sick, it's always better to rest when you're ill than try to really train through. You're not getting many gains anyways. It's just unfortunate, and is what it is, isn't it? Sometimes.
Yeah. Yep, it's the reality. Yep.
Yeah. The next question is, how often should someone fuel on long runs, and is there certain fuel you recommend?
Well, this is a very individual question, and the only way to give an accurate answer, it would be to go to a laboratory and find out at what rate you are burning through carbohydrates when you're running at whatever the pace is you're racing at or doing a long run at. What typically that range will be somewhere in, depending on how fast you're running, somewhere in the, let's say 60 to 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour. Now, how you consume that 60 to 100 grams, that typically most people's stomachs will do better if they, let's say, sip on a drink that has some, sugar in it over the course of that hour, rather than trying to consume, 100 grams of carbohydrate in one mouthful. But I think so it's very hard to say. This depends on, how big you are. I'm not by big, I mean how much you weigh, and also how fast you're running. And so there's no one way to say it, although I think there's an old saying that is, eat early and eat often. And I think that's a pretty wise way to do it. Like, don't wait till 3 hours into a 5-hour run to start fueling. If you're out, it's going to be a pretty vigorous workout, then by all means, start that from the first hour. You should be trying to take something in, and then stay, if roughly how many calories per hour of carbohydrates you're burning, you have at least a gauge of what you want to be taking in.
Scott, would you say, because you train Tom Evans and Ruth Crofty, would they intake as much fuel racing as they do training, like a 5-hour training run versus race?
Sometimes they do, because we're trying to accustom their stomach to be able to process. That's you kind of have to train your gut to to deal with this many calories, and that's not easy to do at all. So yes, from time to time they will be doing it, but they probably aren't fueling. In an easy run, they're not going to be fueling as heavily as they would in a race. But that's what I meant. It depends on how fast you're
the
running.
Intensity.
And then and the size of, for instance, Tom will be consuming considerably more calories and carbohydrate in an hour than Ruth, because she's weighs quite a bit less than he does. So it's, again, there's no one size that fits for everybody. And as far as a fuel, I don't know enough to recommend. I think it depends on, everybody needs to try different fuels out and find out what they can handle, what doesn't bother their stomach, what they like the taste of. If you, for instance, if you like goo, well, I could almost guarantee you, because I did some climbs one time in the Himalaya where we ate nothing but goo for, a full 24 hours, because that was the whole climb, was like a nonstop thing. You can get pretty sick of goo in 24 hours. So you kind of have to find what works for you and what you can tolerate. Kylee, you've been messing around with the Morton fuels. What do you think so far with them?
Yeah, I mean, I do really like their fuels, especially the gels, how they metabolize and don't upset my stomach as quickly. But I find the higher intensity of activity I do, the more I have to stay on fueling. So for example, like mountain bike racing or skimo, I need to ingest sugar like every 30 to 40 minutes to keep on top of it. A long, like 60K trail run, I do ingest calories for sure, but it feels a little bit less acute than if I have to be running at close to anaerobic, right? At the top end of aerobic. So I think for me, it's very intensity dependent. And even as an aside, my partner's a climber, and I got him on to doing gels before he tried to do his maximum climb of the day. And I think mountaineers and climbing and alpinism can benefit from some of these nutrition strategies as well, because that's our primary fuel for all energy, right? Is glucose. So and
especially if it gets very intense.
Exactly. His sport climbing, so that was it. So our next question is from Sashin, and apologies if I mispronounced your name, but he says, what does a training program look like for a VK, and how should one approach strength for the same? This is a really good question. We don't talk about training specifically for those, but I know lots of people are doing those. the summer?
Yeah, I think it is a good question. And it's a bit, it's kind of out of our normal day-to-day where we're talking with people that are, whether it's mountaineering or running, usually preparing for something that lasts multiple hours. Whereas, this is for most people is going to be less, and then for some people considerably less than an hour of effort. So in this case, high intensity training will play a significantly big role. However, I would still recommend periodizing it so that for as long as you can, you're trying to train your body to work in the aerobic realm. So for my recommendation would be to do a lot of training in that, zone 3 and below, for most of the period of your preparation, like over the course of this, let's say, I'm not sure when you're doing these races, but then you can make massive changes to your anaerobic power in a matter of a few weeks of hard interval training. So I think for most people, I wouldn't recommend a steady diet of that all summer long. Maybe some short, very high intensity, like hill sprints, or even, some more power endurance work, like up to, a minute even on a very steep incline, repetitions like that. But no, I wouldn't recommend like super high lactate type workouts as a regular part of your training and preparation for this until you get within about 6 weeks of your the event you're training for. Now, if you plan to do several of these over the course of the summer, then you're probably going to have to spread out that high intensity zone 4 type interval training. But it should be, I'm a believer that the high intensity training that we do for whatever the sport is should be done in as sport specific a manner as possible. And so, don't do these on a bike. I mean, do these running steeply uphill, I mean, probably with poles, depending on the kind of the gradient that you're using. So I would say, these will be done running, and once a week for these really high intensity. But certainly with zone 3 type training, you could manage 2 or so workouts like this and a hill sprint workout. Then as far as strength, I would again try to make my strength training as sport specific as possible. And so that would mean single leg heavy lifts, like, stepping onto a box with a heavy load, or the Bulgarian split squat is another one of favorite for me. I think those can be extremely effective for building that single leg power.
Yeah, and I know something you've said to me too, Scott, is with the high intensity, the shorter the distance, the longer the warm up. So making sure that you're warming up really well for those races and for the training sessions, and also using some of your training sessions as pacing practice, because a common thing I've done in a VK is blowing up. You can go off the gun really hot and then lose power. So using some of the sessions that Scott suggested as a little bit of practice, like what's too far over the edge to maintain for the duration, kind of finding the sweet spot where you're clearing lactate still as you go up. It's a bit of an art.
Yeah, it is. Doing short, high intensity races the warm up is critical. And I think that my experience, especially working with cross country ski sprinters whose race is 3 or 4 minutes long, we want them to enter the start gate sweating and breathing hard. I mean, they need to finish their workout pretty fired up. I mean, the heart rate's high, good sweat going, and that does 2 things. One is that, that's the metabolism they're going to be needing during the race. And so it needs to be cooking along pretty well. The thing it can do with something like a VK is doing that is going to help you not go out too hard. Whereas if you come to the starting line and like you were getting ready to go do a 50-kilometer race, you're going to be so excited, your tendency is going to be to go out way too hard. And then, you'll get the immediate flush of lactate and crash and have to slow way down at the start. So try a fairly intense warm up or
Mhm.
one that builds to higher intensity for the last 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, I found especially maybe it's I don't know if for you, Scott, as I've gotten older, I've needed to warm up even more so. And I can always tell if I'm not warmed up enough because the start, my legs will feel very full of lactate, and then 15 minutes and I'll feel better. And I'm like, oh, I guess that was supposed to be my workout, but that was a warm up in reality. So I think,
Yeah.
yeah,
And it's really not, it's really during the beginning of the workout when what you're feeling with that heavy legs is unlikely to be lactate because it's all
yeah,
been used up. But there's still that sensation that we call lactate, and our legs feel like they flush it out once we start warming up. And but I think that one good way I think to warm up is to, start with a lot of clothes on, start fairly slowly, and then once you've broken a sweat and you start to get, if you get flushed cheeks, or you feel like you're sweating a little bit, that indicates that this capillaries in your skin have dilated and you're sending more blood to the skin to cool off the core. That means your core temperature is now probably up to what it needs to be. It means your muscles are warmed up. It means the metabolism in the muscles is running aerobically. And if that may take you 5 minutes, and it might take you 15 minutes. But I think it's very important to respect that gradual warm up because that's, once you've done that part, then you can move into a more like, let's say, productive warm up. That early stage of the warm up needs to just be waking your body up.
Yeah, Scott, have you, I don't know the answer to this question at all, so asking you, with the lactic shuttle, does that happen quite instantaneously in your body, or is that with a warm up, could you kind of get that lactic shuttle online? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I suspect that I don't know, I'm not a physiologist, but I
Yeah.
suspect, those transport proteins, the MCT1 and MCT4, they're going to be there doing their job whenever. It's just a matter of, like, if you overwhelm, let's say you jumped out of the car, you're late for your start. I think this happened to you actually a couple of years ago.
I've made a lot of mistakes.
You jump out of the car, you're late for the start, and so you sprint to and start warming up. Well, the aerobic system, as we've talked about many times, it takes a while for it to respond to an increase in intensity. So what will happen is, if you jump into your warm up and try to go too hard too soon, then the aerobic system just gets sidelined because it can't meet the energy demands that your body's making on it. So the anaerobic system spools up and starts cranking out the energy you need. But then you've fired up the anaerobic system, and the aerobic system, which is really there to help support the work you're doing, it's asleep because you bypassed it in the warm-up. So that's why this gradual warm-up is important, because if you do that, then you're going to be producing less lactate, because you're going to be relying more on the slow twitch fibers and the aerobic metabolism to produce energy, rather than relying on the fast twitch fibers and the anaerobic metabolism. But I think that the actual lactate shuttle, I can't say, but I suspect it's not very sensitive. It responds to the amount of lactate. If there's more lactate, then the shuttle is going to be busier. But the way to keep the lactate levels lower is with an appropriate warm up.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that we worked on actually last year, Scott, which helped me out a lot. Because my original background with sprinting was in speed skating, a 500-meter event, which is under 1 minute. So my tendency is just to go so hard off races. And then we were talking about how it's just like this, and what you just explained, the anaerobic system just fully takes over. So if you have a sprinting background and you're listening to this, like maybe hockey or football, like me, you might have that tendency as well. So just a really good warm up and then some pacing will help you immensely when you race. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Good. So our next question here is from a CrossFit coach, and they're saying, I've done mostly CrossFit and weightlifting for the past 15 years. I'm pretty sure I have aerobic deficiency syndrome. Assuming I have unlimited training time per week, what would be the maximum amount of aerobic base I could do as volume per week and per session if I want to ramp up as fast as I can? I'm 44 years old. What would be the point where there would be too much diminishing returns? And I think we addressed this a little bit earlier, but maybe there's something you want to add.
Yeah. Well, one thing I can say about people that I've known that have done a lot of CrossFit is they've got a very high work capacity because that's what they've been training. Unfortunately, it's an anaerobic work capacity, but nonetheless, they're strong and they're durable and they have this high work capacity. What could be challenging for those folks is when they shift to this, especially someone who was pretty sure they have aerobic deficiency syndrome, the intensity at which you are going to be needing to train is going to feel so easy compared to what your normal training looks like, that you're going to have mentally, it's going to be very hard for you to believe this is actually doing anything. Mm-hmm. But hopefully you understand the physiology enough to know that you actually do need to train at this low intensity. But the good news for you is that because you have this high work capacity, you could probably do a hellacious volume of this stuff, which will, and as I've said many times before, volume is the biggest stimulus to improving aerobic capacity. So, if you're able to train 10 hours aerobically a week, you're going to see very quick gains compared to someone who can train 3 or 4. So I would be, and I would, maybe you're not a runner. If you are a runner, I would, as I said to that other person, you don't want to jump right into a 100-mile-a-week running program because in 2 weeks you won't be running anymore. But you could use mixed modality, cycling, running, hiking, stair climbing, any of those things will contribute to building this aerobic capacity. And I would say the point where it becomes, you start to see diminishing returns, typically for runners, it's going to be somewhere in the probably 12 to 15 hour per week of running. So 100 plus miles for them. And, for other lower impact sports, think about Tour de France cyclists. They're often training 30 plus hours per week on their bike. So before they would, and they're doing as much as they can. So they may have figured, okay, I don't recover well if I do more than, let's say, ride 35 hours a week. So that would be 5 hours a day, which is, again, for a Tour de France cyclist in their training buildup, is probably not too uncommon. So it's going to depend on the modality. And, but just think of it as more is better until you stop recovering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. And I agree with your first sentiment that most people with this background feel like the training is way too easy. And I would say if you feel like that, Scott's written so many good articles on our site on this and in his book, and just understanding the science behind it will help you to put your head down and go slow and put in the work, because you know what you're doing inside, changing your system, which is, it helps. I think it helps people buy in when they understand why they're doing it. So it's good. The next question is about heart rates. And someone said, what would be the best heart rate method to define zones? Max heart rate reserve, maffetone, because they seem to give me fairly different ranges. So maybe you could even just talk a little bit about those. Some people might not know what those terms refer to.
Yeah. So when you say max heart rate, what I think you're probably alluding to is a percentage of maximum heart rate. And that is an old school way of defining the zones, is to have someone identify their maximum heart rate and then say, okay, the top of zone 1 is going to be at 50% of max heart rate, top of zone 2 is going to be 60, and on up the scale like that. And that is what I used in training for the new alpinism. And I have regretted it ever since I did that, because it's a bad idea. What I was trying to make things as simple as possible, because I didn't think, most climbers would pay any attention anyway. And I didn't want to bother getting, I figured if I made setting up zones too complicated, people wouldn't do it at all. So I used that method, but it's the worst method you could use. Heart rate reserve is, I think, only marginally better, but it does tell you something interesting. Heart rate reserve means the difference between your resting heart rate and your maximum heart rate. And so you can imagine that somebody, let's say, two people have a maximum heart rate of 180, but one of them has a resting heart rate of 75 and the other has a resting heart rate of 40. The person with the resting heart rate of 40 is going to have a much bigger heart rate reserve. They're probably better aerobically adapted. And I don't think that's a great way to define zones, however. The Maffetone method is like these other ones that include percentages and formulas. If you look at it on a statistical basis, it's quite accurate. But is it accurate for you as an individual? What we find typically with the Maffetone method, and again, we use the Maffetone method for people who are, let's say, they don't own a heart rate monitor, or they're brand new and struggling with, figuring this stuff out. We'll just say, okay, we're just going to take your age and subtract it from 180, and that's going to give us almost always a very safe number. It's going to err on the low side of defining the top of zone 2. Now, we have got an extensive amount of writing on the website. I would recommend, since you're thinking in terms of heart rate, you must own a heart rate monitor. I would recommend doing our aerobic and anaerobic threshold tests. And those are very well explained in the article on aerobic assessment on the website. So I won't go into it here, but that's how we define zones with all the people we work with, and everyone who buys a training plan from us, they're directed to do those kinds of tests. And I think they've proven to be quite accurate over the years. So they're simple, they're free, and you can repeat them anytime you want.
Great. Yeah, that's and if you're interested in reading more about those, your books talk quite a bit, and like you said, articles as well on our site. So good. The next question we have is on altitude, and this person says, I was interested to hear more on the impact that training has on performance at altitude. Does a larger aerobic base improve efficiency at higher altitude and reduce perceived exertion? If not, are there any methods of training that can do so, or is it mostly predetermined by genetics and acclimatization? I recently read the Uphill Athlete book and I'm working on my ADS by focusing on volume at lower intensities. Although I've climbed Mount Rainier and other high peaks in my state, I found that I'm fairly sensitive to the altitude and was hoping that after proper training, I would be able to enjoy the climbs more. For more context, I'm fairly new to endurance training. Thanks in advance. We had a similar question last month, I believe.
We did, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
It's a great question. It's really, the people are relatively new to this. They're new to mountaineering, new to endurance training, and are hoping, of course, that this training this way is going to help them at high altitude. So it will help you because you're going to be working more aerobically as you hike up the mountains, and that's a benefit because you can go longer with less perceived exertion. So yes, there are benefits to that will help you at altitude. And in fact, there's a great article on the website about, I think it's called Our Training Methods Put to the Test by some world-class alpinists. And you could go read that and I think it'll help you understand how this can benefit you. But you are correct that acclimatization plays an enormous role at altitude. And you can have an unfit person. You can take the fittest person in the world and take them to a high altitude, and they may struggle compared to an unfit person at that same altitude who has been well acclimated to that altitude. So yes, acclimatization is probably one of the most important factors. There's really, other than spending time at altitude, either real or simulated altitude, there's no way to acclimate that we know of. So you don't have much choice in that. Now, how you acclimate is determined by genetics. And that's quite it's a whole science in and of itself that is not particularly well understood. Some people just do not acclimate very well at all, and other people acclimate extremely easily and quickly. And typically what I've seen and some of the mountaineers I've worked with for years is that the more times you experience high altitude, the more times you've been to altitude, the faster your body seems to acclimatize when you go back. So give yourself a chance. If you're new to this, and you struggled on Mount Rainier, then yes, I can understand how you would be sensitive to altitude. But it very likely will get better. You're probably, like most of us, somewhere in the middle of the bell curve in terms of your responsiveness to acclimatization. You just have to give it time.
Scott, that's why most people kind of progress to 8,000 meter peaks? They do these sort of stepping stone peaks just to see how they respond. Have you had anyone that you train go from 0 to 100, so to speak? Like not
No,
do.
I haven't. I've tried to steer people away from, coming to us and then saying, I want to climb Mount Everest in
Right.
6 months. And I live at sea level and I've never climbed anything. I mean, that's a very expensive and risky approach. That may very well, not only lead to failure, but it may lead to, more dire consequences. So I would, typically we will try to have people do, take smaller steps and learn. You need to give your body a chance to figure this stuff out and to find out if, maybe you don't acclimatize, and then maybe you'll find out that, okay, I really struggle above, 4,000 meters. And if you're like that and you've climbed a ton of peaks around 4,000 meters and you don't ever seem to acclimatize to it, then maybe you want to change your life goal from Mount Everest to something else. Maybe it's just not in the cards for you.
Yeah, that's good. So we're on our last question, Scott. We've pushed through this
I think
marathon.
We've got one more. We missed one. We got to go back.
Oh, yeah.
But that's okay. Let's finish.
Okay, and then you'll bring back. Okay, so maybe two. So this question says, I have an ultra running background and had structured coaching for about 3 years. I saw immense impact on my running from doing muscular endurance hill reps. I also did gym-based muscular endurance sessions. The delayed onset muscle soreness from the gym-based sessions were always a lot worse. So recovery from gym sessions were slower than recovery from hill sessions. Last year, I moved from Cape Town, easy hill access, to Munich with not so easy hill access. It takes an hour via train to get to a decent enough hill for a muscular endurance session. I did this once a week after work last year for my ME training block for Ultra Tour Monte Rosa, which 100 miler. I would leave work at 1600, start hill reps at 1700, and back home by 2100. The train frequency is unfortunately only one train per hour. So the big drawback for this is it's time consuming and might affect sleep that evening. So my question is it better to choose one form of muscular endurance for ME block, or can it work to alternate on a weekly basis a gym-based ME session and a running-based ME session? Kind regards, Daleen.
Great question, Daleen. So both of those training methods are effective, either the gym or the outside. Since you have had really good luck with uphill weighted carries, I'd try to get you to do more of those. But those can be done on a Stairmaster, stair machine in a gym very effectively. So when you're thinking about a time, you'd be able to spend more time recovering or more time doing, easier base training. You might even feel you can do 2 of these in a week if you didn't have to, spend several hours going to and from the workout. So yeah, I would suggest try that. Find a gym with a good stair machine. Get yourself some entertainment, podcast, YouTube, Netflix, whatever it is. And so you can spend some time, because it seems like you've had good luck with that training method already. And I think that would be my recommendation, rather than, yes, the delayed muscle soreness from the gym ME, it's very common, and it can impact other training that you're doing.
Yeah.
So, and there was one more question, Kylie, that we
jumped
over.
We missed one. All
okay.
right.
And I will read the question.
Super.
Hey, Scott, big fan of Evoke and the content you guys put out.
Oh,
After
yeah.
binge listening to a lot of your podcasts on lactate analysis and seeing Jack Kunzel post his data a few months back, I picked up a device myself. when testing my lactate via the ramp protocol on your site with the treadmill, I got some confusing data. Most information I see online refers to the first lactate threshold being around 2.2 millimoles and generally trending under that. I linked my data below for reference, which we're not going to bother with here because nobody can see it. Based on a heart rate drift test, I determined my aerobic threshold to be about 160 to 165, and my blood millimoles support that. The only thing is that my lactate seems to trend around 4 millimole instead of 2 that I see for most elites. I would assume this is due to only having about 18 months of aerobic training. I'm clearly still able to clear lactate at 151 heart rate due to the rapid decrease from when I increased my effort to 159. Do you think the higher level would be due to not much time in endurance training? And the answer is yes. You need more time to make those aerobic adaptations. We see this often with folks that are new to aerobic training, is that they're producing more lactate because they're calling on the glycolytic metabolic system for more of their energy requirements, even at lower intensities. In other words, they're using more carbohydrates, and so the lactate levels are higher. And if you come from a background of a lot of high intensity training, like someone who's done CrossFit or high intensity interval protocols, then yeah, you're going to see that. The good news is that these improvements that you're going to see will continue for years. But all this indicates when you see higher lactates at these lower intensities is that your body is just burning more carbohydrates. So that means it's aerobically not as well adapted. So yeah, and one way to speed this process up could be to try to do some of your aerobic base trainings in a glycogen depleted state, like first thing in the morning after an overnight fast. So there's a really extensive article on that, on fat adaptation and fasted training on the website as well.
Yeah, Scott, I've noticed an uptick in people delving into lactate meters just for their own curiosity. Maybe that's an idea for an article. I know you've written some before, but in-depth one, because it seems like more recreationalists are enjoying testing their data and using that. So yeah.
Yeah, and it didn't hurt, I think, that Peter Attia on his podcast talked about, he uses a lactate meter for monitoring some of his training, and he has, of course, a vastly larger following than we do. So I suspect some of it, I don't know that it's my influence. I think it's more people like him that are having that influence. And there's certainly a lactate meter can be a very useful tool when you understand how to use it. And it's certainly not a necessity. I mean, people have been training without lactate meters for a century. And but they are, if you're kind of a gear freak and you don't mind spending, a few $100s, then they can be a good tool to help monitor, especially this zone 3 type training that we talk so much about.
Yeah, super.
Making sure that you're not like this person who was asking about all the zone 4 training, making sure that you're actually training more in zone 3 than up in zone 4.
Yeah, for sure. No, that would be interesting, and maybe a podcast or article or something we could delve more into. But I think we're at the end of our questions. Thanks, everyone, for your awesome questions, and feel free to send us ones for, I guess, July via coach@evokeendurance.com or DM us on the Instagram. And we enjoy hearing from you. And this is always fun, Scott. I like spending time with you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to see all these wonderful questions. We really enjoy answering them. We enjoy the engagement and just the fact that, folks are thinking about this. It's exciting for us because this is what we do all day, every day.
For sure.
So, all right, well, till next month then. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you soon.